Well, good morning and welcome back to Park City Church. My name is Matt. I'm the pastor here. We're a church in downtown Overland Park. And while we haven't been able to meet in person with so many other churches around the world, it is a privilege to connect with you in this way. And we're glad that you're here. We're in a series, the middle of a series that we're calling New Normal, as our city and yours and the world we live in talks about adjusting to new normals. We've been sitting with that idea as it relates to the resurrection and the difference that Jesus' death and resurrection makes in our lives and the new normal that he opens up for us. And so we invite you to sit with us as we sit with John's gospel today, John chapter 21, and reflect on the difference Jesus makes in our lives now.
Jesus, we love you. Oh, how we love you. You are the one our hearts adore. And all things have passed away. Your love in you. And you lift our weary head, and you make us strong instead. You take these rags and make them beautiful. For all that you've done, we will pour out our love. This will be our anthem song. And Jesus, we love you. And oh, how we love you. You are the one our hearts adore. Jesus, Jesus, we love you. And oh, how we love you. You are the one our hearts adore. And our affection, our devotion, poured out on the feet of Jesus. Our affection, our devotion, poured out on the feet of Jesus. Our affection, our devotion, poured out on the feet of Jesus. Our affection, our devotion, poured out on the feet of Jesus. We love you. And oh, how we love you. And you are the one our hearts adore. Jesus, Jesus, we love you. And oh, how we love you. You are the one our hearts adore.
Our reading this morning comes from John chapter 21, verses 1 through 14. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also called the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," said Simon. They told him, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat. But that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore. But the disciples didn't realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say this, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you've caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat, dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish. But even with so many, the net hadn't torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them. And he did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. With all the extended time at home recently, one of the things we've been doing as a family is reading together a little bit more. And we've been working through some of the books from the Chronicles of Narnia with our daughters. And we've just made our way through The Silver Chair. And we've been listening to audiobooks, a mixture of kind of reading them aloud as a family and audiobooks. And one evening, actually, this past week, I was wrapping up The Silver Chair with the girls, and it was at bedtime, and I spent a little extra time reading, so my wife Jess sort of made her way out to go do some schoolwork of her own. And I finished up reading and came out across the hallway and found my wife with her fingers in her ears trying to focus on her studies. And she's like, "I think you got a little carried away with the book tonight." And it may well have been true, but it's been a lot of fun. The kids have just really enjoyed the stories and some of the suspense. In particular with The Silver Chair, the storyline that I think has sort of hooked them has been this notion that, for those unfamiliar with the story, the main characters, Eustace and Jill, are sent off on a quest. And they're given, in this quest, they're given right at the start 4 signs, indicators that they'll bump into along their journey that will help them, help them along the way, but also help them know that they're on the right way, that they're headed the right direction. And the suspense, as we've been reading and the girls have been reading, trying to identify what those signs were when they happen or when the main characters perhaps miss them. And it's just created some fun conversations with the girls. But sitting with this reading from John's Gospel this morning, I think it works. And scholars have shared and written loads on how John's Gospel works a bit like those signs, that he's told the story of Jesus around specific and particular signs that are meant to help people know who exactly they're looking at. That when they look at Jesus, based on these signs and building his story around these miracles or these incidents in which Jesus reveals a bit of himself to the people he's around, John is helping his readers and us know who it is that we're looking at. And I think this moment that we read this morning, this epilogue to John's Gospel, John chapter 21, another moment after the resurrection where Jesus is going to engage his disciples. This particular moment on the beach around a fire with fish and bread, I think is meant to call to mind a specific sign that has come a little bit earlier in this story. A moment where Jesus feeds a hillside full of people, fish and bread. And that moment itself, where Jesus takes the little bit that's available and feeds a countryside full of hungry, needy people, that moment itself calling to mind events from much earlier in the history of God's people, wandering in the desert and the wilderness, and God with them in the midst of that wilderness and taking care of them, meeting their needs. And now here, right on the beach, this side of Good Friday and Easter, Jesus encountering his disciples and feeding them fish and bread, echoing for his disciples a sign that John has given us just a few chapters earlier. In a sense, telling them and us that this Jesus that they're meeting on the beach is in fact the same one that they've met before. It's helping them to understand this man that you're looking at, helping them to understand him a little bit more, that he is in fact Jesus. And I think as we sit with this story, John is helpful again in helping us to make sense a little bit more as well of who exactly it is that we're looking at when we look at Jesus. That here in this moment, interestingly, John tells us, he lists out some of the disciples that were there. The 3 that he mentions by name are Peter, whom we know has just walked through the ups and downs of denying Jesus. Thomas, whom we read about last week, who has himself wrestled with doubt and uncertainty and needed to scrutinize, to know who Jesus was, and to know that the person in front of him was in fact Jesus. And then Nathanael, we haven't talked about, but Nathanael's story comes right at the beginning of John's gospel. It kind of sets the tone for the rest of the narrative arc, that Nathanael finds himself in a moment. He's approached by others, disciples who have met Jesus at the beginning of this story, and they tell him, we've met the Messiah, right? The Christ from Nazareth. And Nathanael in that moment says, Nazareth? Does anything good come from there? And Nathanael even in this moment expressing skepticism. And now all three of these, Nathanael, Thomas, and Peter, who have themselves wrestled with, who is this person in front of me? Who is this Jesus? Find themselves at this side of the resurrection having a conversation with Jesus around a charcoal fire with fish and bread. Not an accident, I think, that John would name these three. But in the midst of this moment, this conversation, Jesus feeds them fish and bread, calls to mind an incident and a moment that they've experienced before. Almost in a sense, I think, Jesus showing them that the new normal, in a lot of respects, is very similar to the old. That here is Jesus doing things he's done before in the same way that he's done them before, that Jesus here is serving them, inviting them to breakfast, to come and eat. That just as he did at the Last Supper, serving his disciples, washing their feet, he picks up acts and expressions and themes that he's already lived for them. And again, in a sense, telling them in this moment that the new normal in a lot of respects isn't very different than the old. Inviting these disciples who in this moment perhaps feel adrift. They've gone back to what is familiar to them, to fishing, particularly for Peter and the others have followed suit. They are themselves wrestling with distance. They are feeling adrift perhaps from who they thought Jesus was, whatever they thought, whoever they thought him to be, or whatever they thought his mission to be. Now, having gone through Good Friday and the uncertainty of Easter experiences, what does all of this mean? What does it look like? Everything they built their lives around, feeling now distanced from all of that, and maybe distanced from not only from Jesus, but from each other. And I think about that moment. I think about the moment that we're in. I was listening to a local radio show, and the host was interviewing some columnists, and they were talking about social distancing as cities and states think about what it will look like to sort of phase out of quarantine and back into normal life, kind of talking about adjusting to life with social distance. And one of the columnists, who I think really values personal space, was kind of joking like she's really excited because now she has permission to just stiff arm people and keep them at an appropriate distance. And for her, this felt like freedom. And but I think listening to them chat through, and maybe this has been your experience, all of us kind of, in a sense, literally living with physical distance, with what it means to be physically separated from others in maybe ways that we haven't thought about before. But even where we don't experience physical distance, like social distancing, it occurs to me that there are also all sorts of other ways in which distance creeps into our lives. Separation between one another, but also distance in our relationship with God, the God who loves us and created us. The invitation of Jesus to come and eat, that things like shame and regret, fear or uncertainty, all of these things find their way into our lives and drive us apart from one another, but also apart from Christ. Things that the disciples themselves, no doubt, were carrying in this passage. Denial like Peter, uncertainty like Thomas, or cynicism perhaps like Nathanael. All of these things driving us away from the invitation of Jesus to come and eat. But then too, if we just play this story all the way out, which I think is where we find ourselves in John chapter 21, or the backdrop of all of this is that final separation, that ultimate distance of death. And here in this moment, Jesus as he's doing in a really tangible way on the beach. He's closing the distance. He's bringing them back together in community, inviting them back to life with one another around the table, but also bringing them back to community with him, letting them know that they belong here, despite denial and disappointments and all of those things, that they belong here. Jesus in this moment expressing to them that nothing, not even death, can disrupt this relationship. That nothing, not even the distance we experience in death can drive a wedge into the sense of community and belonging that they now know to be true in him. That here in this moment, again, the new normal, it looks a lot like the old normal, right? In this moment, Jesus is about the same things that he's been about all along, and calling the disciples to come and be with him, and feeding them and serving them and taking care of them. All of this, bread and fish, it's really familiar, with one very important exception. One very important exception, that not even death can disrupt this sort of belonging. Not even death can create a distance too far for Jesus to overcome. I was reminded of an interview that Brené Brown, if you're familiar with some of her books, she was giving an interview around one of her more recent ones about braving the wilderness, talking about belonging and the need to connect. And she said over the course of that interview that humans are hardwired to want it, that we want connection. We want to close the distance. And her book goes on to talk about the irony of one way to do that is just being willing to stand alone, to kind of be who you are. But over the course of that interview, she says that desire in us, that's hardwired into us, she says, is something that we want so much that the first thing we do is sacrifice ourselves and who we are to achieve it. And as I think about however true that might be, I think the gospel speaks a new word to that ache and longing in us. That what we see here in this moment, what we see in Good Friday and Easter in the person of Jesus, is that Jesus is the one who does the sacrificing. And he doesn't sacrifice himself so that he can belong. He sacrifices himself so that we can. And through the events of Good Friday and the hope of Easter, we hear Jesus inviting us. We see him closing the distance, saying, "Come and eat. Come and eat." But here's the truth. The truth, I think, for most of us is that we're probably a lot more like Peter and Thomas and Nathaniel and Eustace from the silver chair. Eustace, as we read the story of these two young children on their quest to try and find their way, trying to follow these four signs, and in a moment of exasperation and failure says, "We've muffed the first three." And chances are for most of us, that is where we live. Like Peter, like Thomas, maybe like Nathaniel, we've muffed the first three. And the hope of the gospel and the resurrection is that even in the midst of all of that distance and brokenness, confusion, disappointment, in the midst of whatever that might look like in your life, Jesus is on the beach with a charcoal fire, with fish and bread, familiarly inviting you and me to come and eat. That no matter what your story or the trajectory of your life or where you may have missed it along the way, wherever you might feel separation or distance or brokenness from one another, but more importantly from the God who loved you and created you, that in the midst of all of that, we hear the invitation from Jesus, "Come and eat." And so it's in the spirit of that invitation that I pray for you today, church, this benediction, that whatever you may be experiencing, that you would know the hope and the certainty that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all of creation, that you would know the hope that nothing will be able to separate you from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Go in peace.